Okay, hello again, everybody. This is the second video lecture for our course on the history and principles of literary criticism. And that is, of course, to say that phrase, history and principles of literary criticism, that very kind of mouthful phrase that we have defining our course. It means we're looking at the history of and principles of attempts to evaluate this cultural phenomenon that we call literature, which exists in this society as it does in the society of all languages and always has. Evaluate literature in a narrow and a broad sense. Narrowly, when we're doing criticism, presumably that means we're looking at a given work of literature, be it a poem, play, movie, video game, whatever, and we are asking, is it any good? Broadly, meanwhile, we are looking at the general phenomenon, let's say, of literary expression, and we are asking ourselves what it's good for. Today, nowadays, in the 21st century in this society, today, as I was arguing in the first lecture, we don't really have a very good or a very well-established answer to that second question, what is literature good for? But there certainly have been some answers like that in the past, many more, much richer and more interesting than I sketched in the first lecture. There have been, that is to say, both positive and negative answers to the broader question of literature. What is it good for? And what we're going to do in this course, really, in the simplest way, is we're going to survey some of these historical answers that have been given. Most of them being, let's say, interesting in their own right. So along the way, that means we're going to learn what I think are some very useful concepts, useful not only for the analysis of literature as such, but for our thinking about culture and knowledge in the broadest sense, let's say. And we're going to sharpen, I think, our own ability to consider the questions that hang over a course like this one. Is this or that text any good? And if so, why? What, in the broadest sense, is literature good for? And this, I take it, or I would argue, is a question that we probably care about more than we realize. And by we, I don't even just mean you guys and me, the people who are participating in this discussion. I mean we in the sense of the people in the culture and the society very generally. And it's kind of I think, a strange and cool thing to think about in our society today, certainly in the university today, when we think about the stuff that really matters, is really important, really worth political and civic consideration and so on. We probably don't think in the first analysis about literature. We think about things that are going to create wealth and jobs and invent things and increase human convenience and so on. And that's totally valid. And yet at the same time, I think it's very evident with very little reflection that our encounter with literature and its associated phenomena, movies, music, performances of various kinds, our encounter with that stuff does matter to us a great deal. Literary stuff and other creative stuff whether it's reading a novel, going to movies, going to a concert, participating in a festival, whatever, all that kind of cultural stuff tends to form, for most people, I think, a crucial focal point for their personal activities, their activities with friends and loved ones, and thus for the memories and the creation of personality that comes out of all those kinds of activities. So this is very kind of slippery, very paradoxical, very mysterious, and I think by that token rather profound. We may think of the question of literature as a non-serious question. You know, it's not as serious as computer science or business or economics or biology or what have you. Literature next to those things seems rather non-serious, and yet in another way it's more serious than they are. Maybe the most serious thing that there is. Although, as I said, this is kind of a weird, strange thing. You guys may or may not be aware that in the 80s there was a really awful but very successful band from West Vancouver called Loverboy. You'll still hear their stuff on classic rock radio, of course, and one of their big hits, which I absolutely detested at the time, now of course I find it kind of fun, one of their big hits, of course, was a song called Everybody's Working for the Weekend, right? Everybody's working for the weekend. You're working that serious stuff for the non-serious weekendy stuff. And if you are lucky, let's say your weekend may include an encounter with literature. The serious is taking you to that non-serious. The work is taking you to the weekend where you read a novel or watch a movie or whatever. And so the question for us, as we try to think in a kind of overarching way about the whole phenomenon of literature, the question for us is why? What's in that? What's it good for? Now, the approach that we're taking in this course, by definition, is not really a kind of purely theoretical approach, as you guys know. Ours is an historical course, so we're going back and we're surveying some older views of how we can approach our question of what literature is good for. Excuse me. Now we're going way back to begin our course. I would not say that we are going back to the beginning of thinking about these questions, and that's just because the concept of going back to the beginning is, I think, a very unsafe concept. Because for one thing, there can always be an earlier beginning before your beginning. And for another, you can always choose your beginning in a different direction entirely. But we're going back to start our course to ancient Greece, to Athens in the classical period, that is to say, in the 4th century BC. We're going back approximately 2,500 years then to begin our readings for the course. Traditionally, this, of course, takes us back to a kind of origins of Western culture thing, but that's not the point or the justification for it. The justification for where we start, I think, actually can only be by the content that we find there. Useful content, I mean, for the questions that we're asking in the inquiry we're trying to begin. And I think we do find that where we are going to start. At least that's what I'm going to open up, or try to open up today. We are starting, as you guys know, with a little text by Plato called the Ion. I'm kind of waffling here for a sec, but what I'm trying to say is I think this will prove to be quite an interesting place for us to start, to see what makes it interesting. This little dialogue by Plato, we need to take a few minutes, excuse me, to put it in a little bit of context. historical and cultural context, I mean. Um, and after all, that's one of the side benefits that we get from a course like this one. We're going to have to gather up some contexts from our historical texts and around our historical texts. Very typically, these contexts will just plain be interesting historically, let's say, and anthropologically. So let's talk a little bit then about the ancient Greek context, excuse me. And I want to set it up like this. By the classical period in ancient Greece, circa 4th century BC, about 2,500 years ago, by that period, ancient Greek culture, which was very well established and very kind of self-aware, let's say, the Greeks had and recognized two main sources of knowledge. Okay? And I mean knowledge there in a fairly broad sense, but also in a really strong sense. Nothing kind of, mystical or tentative about it. They had two sources of what they considered to be the understanding of facts, knowledge. Knowledge both of themselves and of the world. The first of these sources for knowledge that the ancient Greeks had, and this is one that we'll talk about a little more when we're looking at Aristotle in a couple of weeks. The first of these sources that they had for knowledge of themselves and of the world was their religion. And I don't want to say too much about that today. We're looking, of course, when we're looking at the ancient Greeks, at a rather sophisticated nature religion or paganism, the focal points of which were found in temples, and especially in temples where you would encounter an oracle. That means a priest or priestess who supposedly can channel a god. So you would go to the oracle at Delphi, for example, the great oracle of Apollo, and you would come into the temple and you would give your offering and you would say, "Oh, great God Apollo, is this a good year for me to renovate my bathroom?" And you would get an answer, usually a rather mysterious and elliptical answer from the priestess, probably high off her can on cannabis or magic mushrooms or whatever they can get. So that's a very, very fascinating cultural history, I think. In any case, that was one source of what the Greeks considered to be knowledge of themselves and of the world. The other source, however, which is germane to our purposes here, the other source was literature. And that included tragic drama, which again we'll come back to a little bit later in our course, but also poetry, lyric poetry, that is to say shorter songs, and also narrative poetry, poetry that tells stories. Above all, the Greeks, in this literary vector, the Greeks considered themselves to have a source of knowledge. Again, that's in a strong, although broad sense. A source of knowledge in the two epic narrative poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that were attributed to a writer they called Homer. The Iliad, of course, being the story of the 10-year siege of the city of Troy by an army of Greek warriors. The Odyssey then being a sequel to the Iliad. The Odyssey tells the story of another 10 years, the 10-year journey home of the war leader Odysseus. And both of these texts, needless to say, are, well, let's put it this way, extremely awesome and should be added to everybody's beach time reading list if they have not made it already. And there's lots and lots of fantastic translations out there. We know today some very, very interesting things about these texts attributed to Homer, which is a phrase I'm using rather carefully for reasons that will become apparent momentarily. We know today that these texts had their origins in a much earlier phase of ancient Greek culture, probably going back to what scholars call the archaic phase of ancient Greek culture. Uh, excuse me, bit of a cold around here. Not COVID, I promise, just a cold. Anyway, we're safe. Uh, Probably these texts are going back to around 1200 BC, the period of the Mycenaean culture in Greece. There are stories of heroes, Achilles, Odysseus, and so on, who had a kind of quasi-religious demigod status in ancient Greek culture. We also know, and this is a very, very fascinating business, I think. Apologize for my cough drop. We also know that these texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were originally oral texts. So we know today there was almost certainly never anybody called Homer who came up with these stories. Rather, what they are kind of songs around the campfire, oral literature passed down in memory for many generations before finally being written down. So that's just very, very fascinating stuff about these amazing texts. The Greeks of the classical period, Plato's period, they don't know any of that. They don't know that they're reading, when they're reading Homer, they're reading texts that were originally oral. They don't, they don't know that they're reading something which is the product of a kind of bardic tradition. They do, however, know, and they have a strong awareness that when they are reading Homer, they are reading stories that have been transmitted from the past of their own culture. They don't really understand how far back in the past, but they certainly venerate Homer in part because he is ancient from their perspective. Okay? So when the Greeks turned to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, in their view, in their minds, they were turning to what we can call the teachings of their own culture. They viewed these poems very much as founts of ancient wisdom, and they took it for granted that one needed to know these poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, not just to be able to say that one was educated, but rather and precisely because these poems, again, were considered to be a site of knowledge. The source, as I have said, apart from those oracles. So, what is this framing work doing for us as students of the history and principles of literary criticism? Well, it means that when we are looking at that ancient Greek scenario, we're looking at a time and place, a culture and a context in which, again, literature is about knowing, learning and knowing stuff. And the literary classroom is a site of learning and knowing stuff. And so that is an assumption about what literature fundamentally is, what it's for. That's an assumption about what literature fundamentally is that is, I think, radically different from assumptions that we would tend to find operating in our culture today. And by the way, to say that it is different is certainly not to establish that the ancient Greek attitude is preferable or correct. Not at all. It's simply to establish that difference, and that difference, I think, is really quite interesting. And there's one more part of this introductory story. By the classical period, the period of Plato, Socrates before him, Aristotle after him, by the classical period, literature as a site of knowledge, a knowledge-producing activity, literature was being challenged by another kind of intellectual activity. So literature, let's say, is an activity of inspired expression. This other new activity was one of what we can call perhaps inspired observation. Literature is all about the words. This new activity was all about the ideas. And perhaps it's evident where this is going or what we are talking about. We're talking about the advent in classical Greece of what came to be called philosophy, philosophia, the love of wisdom. Originally, this also is an activity, philosophy, which certainly included what we now call natural philosophy, which means philosophy or wisdom about the natural world, which nowadays, of course, is what we call science. So, looking at classical Athens, we're looking at a culture where, first of all, literature is on the table as a site of knowledge. That's very interesting. And second of all, literature is being pushed off that table, or at least being challenged for its position on that table by an entirely different claim of what knowledge seeking fundamentally is, the claim of philosophy. Plato speaks for that other claim, the claim of philosophy challenging literature as a knowledge generating activity. And Plato expresses this challenge to literature for the most part in two of his works. One of them is his masterwork, The Republic, which we'll read a bit of in a week or two. But the other is this little piece that we are dealing with today and over the next couple of lectures, I think. This little piece called the Ion. And I certainly am going to try to show that this piece, the Ion, has some very, very interesting things to put on the table for us. The name of this work, by the way, of course, has nothing to do with the polarization of molecules or anything like that. It's rather the name of the title character, Ion, and that's typical of Plato's works. They are all, or almost all, what are called dialogues, right? Which means they're little imaginary plays or playlets, exchanges, imaginary conversations between real historical people. These are people who, let's say, dominated the intellectual and cultural scene of Athens in the generation just before Plato's own. So Plato is writing these dialogues about people who were mature men, and they all are all men, I'm afraid. Mature men when Plato was a kid. It's that kind of thing. The dialogues all feature, for their kind of philosophical protagonist, they all feature or star the man who was Plato's teacher in philosophy, Socrates, and again, of course, that's a real person who was put to death by the Athenian authorities in 399 BC on a charge of corrupting the youth of Athens. So this is one of the most famous stories in the intellectual history of the world, let's say. So there's a couple. I'm mentioning some of this stuff mostly because I kind of want it to be thumbtacks in the board that we may want to come back to. Plato never actually speaks in his own voice in these works. He always puts words in Socrates' mouth. He's always writing these little plays, little playlets in which these various figures of classical Athens converse about philosophical topics. There's always, in short, a kind of distance between Plato as an author of these works and the subject matter or the arguments that the works develop. So again, those are sort of points in the board that we may or may not want to come back to later on, perhaps much later on in our look at this material. But for now, and for the remainder of this lecture, I want to get into the text and introduce it a little bit. Ion, as I've said, is the title character. And I'm going to read a little bit of the dialogue. I will ask you guys to be responsible for following along with your own copy of the text, which of course is available in PDF on our Canvas syllabus. So if you don't have that in front of you right now, I would actually ask that you pause the lecture and go get it, because it is important to follow along with the bits of this text that we are going to talk about. Ion is a very carefully chosen person and kind of person of the classical Athenian scene for Plato to choose and insert into this dialogue as its title character. Ion is what's called a rhapsode. That means he is a professional reciter of poetry. Specifically, he is a professional reciter or performer of Homer. This was a major aspect of ancient Greek cultural life. It's a little bit, again, like those cycles of tragic plays, which we'll talk about more in a couple of weeks. But you could go see a performance of Homer by a rhapsode, somebody who is a Homer professional. It seems that Ion is very good at being a rhapsode. He travels around from festival to festival, from competition to competition, just wowing people with how awesomely he recites Homer. And Plato, via Socrates, Plato gives us actually a little description of the rhapsodic scenario, let's say, what it's like when Ion or somebody like him recites Homer for an audience of ancient Greeks. The description, as I said, comes in. It's on page 9 in our version of the text, where Socrates describes Ion. He says, "You produce the greatest effect upon the audience in the recitation of some striking passage in Homer, such as the apparition of Odysseus leaping forth on the floor, recognized by the suitors, and casting his arrows at his feet, or the description of Achilles rushing at Hector, or the sorrows of Andromache, Hecuba, or Priam." Ion says that when he tells a tale of pity, his eyes are filled with tears. When he speaks of horrors, his hair stands on end and his heart throbs. And at the bottom of this same page, page 9, Ion describes looking down on the spectators, or auditors, I guess we could say, the audience. Looking down on the audience from the stage when he's reciting or performing Homer, and behold the various emotions of pity, wonder, sternness stamped upon their countenances when I am speaking. So this is the kind of thing that the rhapsode does. He gets up on a stage and he recites Homer from memory, almost certainly from memory. In reciting Homer, he gets so caught up in the emotions of the various scenes that Homer describes that the audience similarly gets caught up. People cry, people laugh, people are filled with terror or delight, as the appropriate case may be. That's the rhapsode's art. So we don't have, I think, rhapsodes anymore, although perhaps that would be a really interesting question for discussion in tutorial this week. Do we have rhapsodes? I'm not sure what the answer perhaps would be to that question. It's a little bit like he's an actor. That's part, certainly, of what Ion does. But maybe a better word for what he does is to say that he is an interpreter of Homer. And Ion himself uses that word for the nature of his activity. Interpretation of Homer, that's the word seemingly for his skill or his art or his expertise. And this again is a term that I would like to come back to in tutorial. It's a term that we can, I think, do some very, very useful, very rich, productive thinking about. But for the moment, let's say that when Ion interprets Homer, that means he performs Homer, but precisely by way of making Homer accessible to the audience. Do you see? It's a little bit like what happens when a pianist performs some difficult work of music, Mozart or Beethoven or what have you. And in fact, we will use that word, won't we? We'll say the pianist interprets Beethoven. That means in part that the artist is putting her or his own spin on the work, but it also means that the artist, the pianist in this example, the artist is precisely trying to make it so we can understand the work, feel it, and grasp it. So Ion is a performer. He's not a poet, a creative artist in his own right in that way, but he is a performer of poetry. And that includes seemingly the idea that he knows or understands Homer. And Ion speaks very kind of, excuse me, very kind of confidently and strongly about this in the dialogue. He really knows Homer. This is what he keeps telling Socrates. And because he really, really understands Homer, he is able to interpret Homer for the audience. He's able to help the audience understand Homer too. And sometimes when you are reading the stuff, when I'm reading the stuff that Ion says, there are echoes of the literary classroom, which after all sometimes can be kind of a rhapsodic place when it goes very well. But let's just say Ion is introduced to us by Plato as a figure of literary knowledge and a figure of this classical Athenian assumption that literature precisely is a site of knowledge and needs to be approached in that way. Ion, the rhapsode, very, very good at what he does, covered in honors and awards. He's very puffed up, very self-confident, which is and this is very much the kind of interlocutor that Plato's Socrates likes, because what Plato's Socrates does in all of the dialogues really is encounter somebody who claims to know a bunch of stuff. And Socrates' method is sort of reductive and deflationary. He asks questions which end up showing that the person he's talking to doesn't really know anything at all. That's kind of the running gag, if you like, albeit a very, very complex gag that occurs in basically all, I think, of the Platonic dialogues. The beginning of our dialogue, which I'm not going to read, page 4, Ion comes on, he runs into Socrates, they have this little chat, Ion talks about how awesome he is. Socrates, kind of nods, yes, you certainly are, very awesome, Ion. And then Socrates starts asking questions. I'm now at the bottom of page 4, the first page in our PDF. Ion has just been saying how excellent a job Ion, does at reciting Homer. And he's been saying that the Homeridae, that's a name for a kind of society of Homer nuts, should give him a golden crown. Socrates says, I shall take an opportunity of hearing your embellishments of him at some other time. But just now I should like to ask you a question. Does your art, Socrates asks Ion, does your art extend to Hesiod and Archilochus, or to Homer only? This little question is where Socrates' ball starts to roll, let's say. Hesiod and Archilochus, these are two other archaic Greek poets. That's all we need to know about them. What we need to notice is that Socrates is asking Ion to evaluate his own art, his art as a rhapsode, his own skill as a rhapsode, what it's good for. And Socrates is beginning this line of questioning by asking Ion if he is expert only in Homer, or if he's also expert at other poets, such as Hesiod and Archilochus. Ion answers very directly, Homer only. He is in himself quite enough. So Ion says, no, I'm just all about the Homer. Don't do the other guys. Homer is the man, and Homer's the one I know. Socrates goes on to ask, are there any things about which Homer and Hesiod agree? Ion says, yes, in my opinion, there are a good many. Socrates persists, and can you, Ion, can you interpret better what Homer says or what Hesiod says about these matters in which they agree? Ion says, I can interpret them equally well, Socrates, where they agree. Socrates goes on, but what about matters in which they do not agree? For example, about divination, about which both Homer and Hesiod have something to say. Very true, says Ion. Divination means telling the future, of course. We need to be aware, just as a kind of footnote here, that divination, or telling the future, that sounds crazy and silly to us. It's not crazy or silly in the ancient Greek context. This is what priests of the ancient Greek religion did, tell the future by observing bird flight and cutting open animals and observing their entrails and so on. I won't continue reading the text. I think I'll just summarize it a little bit. Socrates is asking Ion, okay, if Homer and Hesiod, let me back it up one sec. Sorry, got a little bit tangled up there. Socrates is asking Ion a couple of things, and it comes in rather densely and quickly. First of all, he asks Ion in this exchange we've just been looking at. He asks Ion, okay, are you all about the Homer, or can you also do like Hesiod and Archilochus? Ion's position is, no, I'm just about the Homer. Socrates says, okay, but what about cases where Homer and Hesiod agree about something, say the same stuff? Can you interpret them equally well in that case? Ion says, yeah, I guess so. If they're on the same page, sure, I can do that. Socrates then presses the point and turns it around a little bit, saying, okay, what about if Homer and Hesiod disagree about something? Prophecy, for example. Can you interpret them equally well if they disagree? No. That's going to be Ion's position, because he's all about the Homer. And a final step in this opening stage of Socrates' argument. If they disagree, Homer and Hesiod, let's say about divination, this activity of ancient Greek religion. If they disagree about divination, who's qualified to evaluate them? Who's qualified to say who's right and wrong, who's better, Homer or Hesiod? Would it be you, Ion, the rhapsode, who's qualified in that case? Or would it rather be somebody who is an expert in divination, a prophet or priest would be another word we could put there? And Ion quickly answers, well, of course, in that case, I wouldn't really be able to interpret Homer and Hesiod equally well if they disagree. The person who would be able to break the logjam, so to speak, who would be able to evaluate these two poets and say which of them had the right end of the stick, which the wrong, the person who would be able to do that would not be me, the rhapsode, it would be an actual expert, in this case a prophet, who is expert in divination. And we're coming now up to, let's say, the salient point for the whole discussion that Socrates is trying to get on the board in the Ion. And so I think what we'll do is just try to map out this point as fully and clearly as we can, and then we'll bring this lecture to a close, okay? Socrates has it in for Ion. Let's put it that way. He seems like your friend, Socrates. He is not your friend. He's going to show you that you think you know a lot of stuff, and actually you don't. That's what Socrates tries to do. He's not Ion's friend. Ion thinks he knows a lot of stuff. Ion thinks he knows Homer. Socrates' goal in this dialogue, the Ion, is to shoot gigantic holes in the idea that Ion knows anything, and indeed to shoot gigantic holes in the idea that knowing Homer even means anything. So this friendly, polite little dialogue is actually quite radical and intellectually destructive, I think. Plato, or at least Plato's Socrates, is setting out to sink the ship of literary knowledge. He's setting out to insist that literature is not knowledge at all. Sorry, guys. Smoke is really bad right now. So let's try to wrap up. Socrates does this, or starts this, by zeroing in on a very, very powerful, very, very important, and yet clearly totally ordinary concept, which comes in at that exchange between him and Ion at the bottom of page 4, beginning of page 5 in our PDF. The concept, you guys, is the concept of things. Socrates is pointing out to us, at the expense of Ion, some obvious matters, obvious insights. When he asks Ion about being expert in Homer and being expert in Hesiod, can you interpret them equally well when they agree about something? And Ion's answer to that is yes, but not when they disagree about something. What Socrates is getting at, and again, it's a very powerful and yet totally ordinary insight. What he's getting at is that texts, by definition, are about things in a very, very broad and vague sense. Things, facts, topics, issues, questions, contents, aspects of the world. That's what texts are about. And understanding a text, being expert in that text, mastering a text, whatever it may be, precisely means mastering what the text has to say about various things, the stuff it is about, that text. Ideas, topics, facts, phenomena, aspects of the world that the text is about, because all texts are about things of one kind or another, right? And by the way, partly in order to make it less likely that any of us goes completely insane from ceaseless repetition of the word things, I want to introduce an alternative term which will serve us as a kind of technical term for this kind of discussion, the phrase is subject matter, okay? Which simply denotes the stuff that any text is about, its content. That we can call its subject matter. Subject matter then being some kind of aspect of the world around us. What has happened early here in this little dialogue, the Ion, is that Socrates has gotten Ion to agree to a certain view of what his own expertise is. Ion claims to know Homer, to understand Homer, to be expert in Homer. Socrates has gotten Ion to commit to the view, to commit to the position that being expert in Homer, understanding Homer, precisely means understanding Homer's subject matter, the stuff his text is about. Socrates has gotten Ion to commit to the further position, again, in this very early exchange, that any expertise whatsoever is precisely an expertise in subject matter, some aspect or phenomenon of the world. The mathematician is expert in math, the physician is expert in what keeps you healthy, the carpenter is expert in building houses, the prophet is expert in divination, and so on and so forth. What therefore is placed in question or in crisis by Socrates in this dialogue is, of course, the text. Because if expertise, if knowledge, if understanding is always about the things, what the heck does it mean to claim expertise in text? What the heck does it mean to claim understanding of literature per se? Socrates' argument in this dialogue, and it is a very powerful and I think very destructive argument, and I mean that as a compliment, I don't mean to be cross about it. Socrates' argument is there is no content to the idea of being expert in literature. His argument is if you claim to know literature, you're claiming to know nothing. Okay? That is the very radical argument of philosophy as an insurgent discipline that Plato's Socrates is offering in the Ion. And we're going to have to wrap up there. This lecture already went on longer than I wanted. Sorry about that. I hope you took some nice breaks. But that is certainly enough to get this text on the table for us. There will be lots more to say, though, over the next couple of lectures. Okay, thank you very much, as always, for paying attention, guys. And I will see you in tutorial this week after the second lecture course. Okay, thank you again. Bye-bye.